Hello students, and welcome to lecture number 8 in Dr. Lewis's course on European history, 1500 to the present. In our previous lecture, we talked about the dynamics of World War I and how World War I brought death not just to soldiers, to many traditional aspects of European society. One of the most enduring legacies of World War I, though, are the birth of two different totalitarian movements in the 1920s and 1930s that reshaped global politics for the 20th century and brought about a second global conflict known as World War II. Today we'll be looking at the dual ideologies of communism and fascism. Today's lecture will explore a number of themes through the following 4 questions. Number 1, how did the Russian Revolution impact the world of the early 20th century? Number 2, how did European elites, and veterans in particular, react to the rise of communism? Number 3, why did so many economic elites support fascism, particular corporations? And number 4, what impact did fascism have on the development of the modern world? Being the first group of successful revolutionaries inspired by the ideas of Karl Marx, Vladimir Lenin and the Russian communists had some strong notions of what they disliked in the world, but did not have a ready-made blueprint on how to establish the world's first socialist society. The two broad principles that guided the ideas of the early communists were ideas about social equality and economic equality. For centuries, Russian society had been extremely stratified in the traditional feudal sense of European society, with aristocrats ruling over the majority of people who had little to no social equality. The first constitution put in place by the communists in 1918 declared that all Russian peoples who lived in the Soviet Union were all free and all equal. Number 2, it also guaranteed to all Soviet citizens the right to free education and to free health care. Number 3, for the fact that aristocrats had owned the land throughout Russia for centuries, and that the Russian Orthodox Church had also been the major landowners in Russia, all private and church land was seized by the government and redistributed to peasants who had never had the legal right to own land. And even though eventually the Soviet government became associated with ideas of atheism, initially Soviet revolutionaries were inspired by ideas of freedom of worship, and particularly trying to take on the long historic trends that Russian society had had of discrimination and persecution of Jews. The Soviet government became the first nation in the world to make anti-Semitism an illegal practice. The other great challenge in terms of the ideas of equality when it came to socialism was to facilitate economic equality amongst all Soviet citizens. Under the new Soviet constitution, workers were guaranteed direct control over the factories that they worked in and the right through a democratic process to elect the managers who ran over the factories. Number 2, soldiers were told that they would now have direct control over the military, and that all officers in the Russian military and the Soviet Red Army would now be elected by the rank-and-file soldiers. Number 3, for the fact that Russia was highly in debt from World War I and from a number of different projects prior to World War I, the new Soviet government said that the new government would not hold up any debts that the previous Russian government had, and that any debts that the Soviet citizens had prior to the Russian Revolution was also going to be legally canceled. Number 4, they also established an 8-hour workday, minimum wages, and also maximum wages on how much a Soviet entrepreneur could make in this new socialist-style economy. The great problem with ideas about rights and about equality was that immediately, with the success of the Russian Revolution, came a threat of a counter-revolution. A civil war broke out in Russia in 1917 that lasted all the way up until the year 1923. And while on paper the new Soviet government promised all sorts of progressive ideas of equality, in reality, for the fact that Russia was such a poor and distraught nation, all they did was create a new legal system where all people were legally equal, but also all legally poor. The most powerful book ever written about the Russian Revolution was by the historian Orlando Figes, an 1100-page manuscript entitled A People's Tragedy. The reason why Figes chose this particular title was primarily because of the experience of the Russian Civil War, arguing that the Russian Revolution was supported by the Russian people in the hopes of getting peace. But the great tragedy of what they got instead was a 6-year civil war that led to the death of 9 million more Russian people. Due to the radical nature of the communist ideology promoted by Lenin's regime, and also for the fact that the Russians had pulled out of World War I early, 16 different nations from the West decided to intervene in the Russian Civil War to punish the Vladimir Lenin's government for pulling out of the war earlier and trying to topple this communist regime to make sure that the Russian Revolution did not spread in the same way the French Revolution had spread in 1789. The two sides that faced off in this Russian Civil War were the Russian Red Army, organized and led by the intellectual Leon Trotsky, that had over 5 million men, most of them peasants. These peasants were fighting for ideas about land ownership and fighting for ideology, fearing that if aristocrats were allowed to return back to rule in Russia, that these peasants would lose the land that had just been granted to them by the new Soviet regime. The White Army that faced off against the Russian Red Army was led by General Yudenich. While General Yudenich only had approximately 250,000 soldiers, what he did have as an advantage against the Red Army was constant resupply lines coming from 16 different nations from the West, including Great Britain, the United States, and ironically enough, even though we had just gotten done fighting against them, Germany, assisting in this war against the Soviet Union. Initially, Yudenich and the White Army were fighting to restore the Tsar to power, trying to topple this new revolutionary regime. After the Tsar and his family were executed by the communists during the summer of 1918, Yudenich simply had a plan to take revenge for the death of the Tsar and to inflict as much damage as possible on the Russian people for supporting Lenin and his new government. The Red Army, as I've said, was an army of peasants fighting for land and ideology. The White Army thrived on Western assistance. And while one can judge the corresponding sides in many different ways, the most important thing to understand is the outcome. By 1923, when the Russian Civil War finally came to an end, the Russian people had lost 9 million more people, not just through the chaos of war, but primarily through starvation. The soldiers who fought in the Russian Army of World War I and the Red Army of the Civil War were peasants who weren't back home growing the grain that the Russian people needed to eat and survive. Coming out of this experience, the communists came out incredibly isolated, ruling over one of the poorest nations of the world that had just gone through 6 years of mass destruction and suffering. Not exactly an ideal state to try and create a communist utopia. The true power of communist ideology had little to do with the experience of the Soviet Union, and more to do how the new international organization, the Communist International, reached out to young people throughout the world with a radical ideology and a radical analysis of the world, arguing that if revolution did not happen and did not happen soon, that World War II would be right around the corner. In this pamphlet from 1923 addressed to youth, the communists argued, quote, "Must the world always be one vast slaughterhouse? Must the world always be one vast arsenal, with each war yet greater and more terrible? Yes, as long as capitalism exists. So long as capitalism exists, so long as the state is in the hands of the capitalists, then so long will there be wars. Capitalism is the cause of modern war. To abolish war, you must abolish capitalism. This is the whole crux of the matter. Unless the capitalist system is overthrown, a repetition of the criminal war is not only possible, but is inevitable." Essentially, communists reaching out to young people around the world who had lived through World War I and experienced the horrors of this, saying, unless you support the Russian Revolution and promote a revolution in your own nation, World War II will be right around the corner. Before we can truly understand historically the rise of fascism, we need to dispel with a modern popular culture notion that equates socialism and fascism as the same thing. Socialism and fascism, while they are often both associated as totalitarian ideologies, are completely opposed on almost every single aspect of what the movements stand for and who supports them. To understand this, we'll take a few quotes here from some of the early British fascist movement and from the Italian fascist movement to understand how fascists interpreted socialism. A pamphlet from the British Union of Fascists that was published in 1926 stated, "Fascism is the avowed opponent of communism and socialism." Benito Mussolini in 1928, when asked by a reporter what fascism stood for, he said, quote, "The socialists ask what is our program. Our program is to smash the skulls of the socialists." If one were to call Mussolini a socialist, it's quite likely that if a baseball bat were there at hand, that he would smash your skull for calling him a socialist, saying, "This is what we do to socialists." His final quote from Benito Mussolini, who was the founding father of the fascist movement, says, "Fascism is the complete opposite of socialism. It affirms the immutable, beneficial, and fruitful inequality of mankind." If you remember our previous lessons on the French Revolution and the revolutions of 1848, essentially what fascism stands for in the 1920s is a new form of counter-revolution to offset many of the democratic ideals coming out of the socialist movement. In one of our first lessons in this course, we talked about the ideas of the Enlightenment that had been laid by the experience of the scientific revolutions of the 16th and 17th centuries. Enlightenment philosophers, while they disagreed on a number of things, they broadly agreed on several basic statements. Number one, that governments should be based upon law and upon systems, that you needed to limit the arbitrary rule that kings and queens traditionally held over society. Number two, while they disagreed in many ways on how to implement such systems, most Enlightenment philosophers would both embrace and promote ideas about equality. Not always taking a step further ideas about social and economic equality, but ideas about equality involving citizenship. And number three, since the Enlightenment movement came out of the scientific revolution, Enlightenment thinkers had a great, deep belief in the principles of rationality and reason. They believed that societies set up upon rational and reasonable principles could create a scenario for peaceful development of humankind that was in the interests of all people. Fascism is a rejection of all of these ideas. Adolf Hitler's Minister of Propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, once said to a reporter, he said, "When we are done with our fascist revolution, 1789 will have never happened." What the fascists believed in was essentially trying to turn back the clock of time to how Europe was set up prior to the Enlightenment, and to bring back in a day based upon authoritarian rule, embracing the inherent inequality of human beings, and number three, embracing concepts of irrationality and emotion, arguing that what truly brought people together was the true driver of society was not peaceful relations, but war. In the big picture, what fascism was doing was rejecting ideas about democracy and socialism with the principles of equality, and rejecting what they called an unjust peace that was enforced upon the Central Powers after the end of World War I. Even though technically communists and socialists are different, we're going to use the terms interchangeably throughout the rest of this course. Essentially, all you need to know is that communists were more radical forms of socialists who followed the Russian revolutionary Vladimir Lenin and believed that revolution was something that needed to happen immediately, not something in some far distant future. Two terms that we will not use interchangeably, though, are communism and fascism. While there are two aspects of these movements that are common, the groups that fund and support these movements, you couldn't get any two different movements if you tried. What these two movements do have in common is both communism and fascism were born in the experience of veterans during World War I and their vision of the world once this war was over. Veterans, after the war, were more than willing to utilize things such as violence to advance political goals, because if you think about what a soldier is doing, they're on the battlefield as they're utilizing violence to advance the political goals of a nation, and all a communist or a fascist is a soldier who is no longer out on the battlefield of World War I, but who's now in the streets of major cities utilizing violence to advance their own political parties' ideas about the world. Number two, when it comes down to governments, both communists and fascists envision taking over governments and not sharing power with other political parties. They wanted essentially to be what we call totalitarian parties that created dictatorships based upon one-party rule. What's completely different about these two movements, though, has to do with social class and the class conflict between poor working class people and between wealthy elites who own corporations. If you look at the basis of the communist movement, communists were funded and supported by the working class to attack the institutions of corporations. Now, if we look at a more realistic class-based notion of fascism during the 20s and 30s, fascism in its essence is a movement funded by corporations to attack working class groups. Now, based upon this radical notion of what fascism is, we have to ask the question, during the 1920s and 1930s, why on earth did the rich make the choice to support fascism in Europe? So historians, to understand Adolf Hitler, need to ask the question why it is in our modern historic memory and popular culture memory that we associate Hitler only with ideas of racism, genocide, and war. And while there's very good reasons to associate Hitler with these things, if we only associate Hitler with these factors, it throws off the fact that in 1938, Adolf Hitler was granted Time Man of the Year for his consistent anti-communist and pro-business policies. Part of the reason why we as Americans remember these negative aspects of Hitler was that 2.5 years after the outbreak of World War II, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, and since Japan was allies with Nazi Germany, this brought the United States into World War II. But for the first 2.5 years of this conflict, we were a neutral power, and Adolf Hitler was not considered our national enemy. When we think of Adolf Hitler, we think of images like this. These survivors of the Auschwitz death camp, when they were discovered by the Allied powers at the end of World War II, were much like walking ghosts. Now, one of the reasons why they were there at Auschwitz had to do with their ethnicity and their religion. Most of the people at Auschwitz were Jews. But outside of simply utilizing Auschwitz as a factory of death, what else did Auschwitz stand for? Auschwitz was also a slave labor camp where corporations set up factories right there on site and utilized individuals like this as free workers that the corporations did not have to pay and that they could literally work to death. In the year 1924, Adolf Hitler wrote a personal political autobiography and manifesto entitled Mein Kampf, which translates to My Struggle. Throughout this 1,000-page manuscript, Adolf Hitler laid out his ideas on almost every single issue facing the German nation in the 1920s. But one of the parts that we oftentimes forget about when it comes to Hitler's policies is quotes like this. It's a selected quote here from Mein Kampf from 1924 that says, quote, "We must reduce workers' salaries and take away their right to strike." Now, if you think about business leaders, particularly ones who are struggling with the context of the Great Depression after the year 1929, if workers have lower wages and they don't have the right to strike, this means for wealthy people, particularly people involved in corporations, this means more profits. If we look at a quote from another book that was published in the year 1941 by Fritz Thyssen, who was head of the German steel industry throughout the 1920s and 1930s, Fritz Thyssen writes in his book entitled I Paid Hitler, quote, "I believe that by backing Hitler and his party, I could contribute to the reinstatement of real government and of orderly conditions which would enable all branches of activity, and especially business, to function normally once again. The present nature of the Nazi economy has necessarily led to war." This is the head of the German steel industry saying 2 years after World War II broke out, saying, how did Hitler get into power? Well, I paid for it all. Why did I pay for it all? Well, I thought it'd be good business for my corporation. What did that lead to? Led to World War II. But for the fact that Fritz Thyssen wrote a book saying that he was sorry when he was put on trial for crimes after World War II, he was found innocent of all crimes, even though he was the main person who had paid for Hitler's rise to power. If you remember our lecture on World War I, one of the themes we hit on with the slides about 1915 and 1916 was the phenomenon of war profiteering. Remember, even still in modern times, when nations go to war, that the products that they utilize for war, whether they be uniforms, whether they be guns, whether they be bullets, whether it be all the basic necessities of a soldier, these are manufactured by private corporations through government contracts. World War I, some people estimate that World War I helped to create almost 10,000 brand new millionaires and billionaires in the US economy alone. Now, if we think about that on a global level, for the fact that World War I had made so many corporations incredibly wealthy, the prospect of World War II sounded pretty nice for many of these same corporations. To understand the relationship between corporations and fascist governments, we'll look again here at a quote from Benito Mussolini, where Mussolini says, quote, "Fascism should more properly be called corporatism, because it is the merger of state and corporate power. The corporate state considers that private enterprise in the sphere of production is the most effective and useful instrument in the interests of the nation. In view of the fact that private organization of production is a function of national concern, the organizer of the enterprise is responsible to the state for the direction given to production." Essentially what Mussolini is saying here, if we break it down, as he says, while the socialists say that corporations are bad and inefficient, that governments should take things over, he said fascists take the exact opposite stance. They say that corporations are good, they're efficient, they're well maintained, and what he hopes is under a fascist regime is to change the relationship between governments as public institutions and corporations as private institutions. Essentially the idea of handing out government contracts to private corporations to build up materials for World War II, and these private corporations, regardless of what they thought of the ideology of fascism, saw these different governments, particularly in the context of the Great Depression, as guarantees to keep their corporations profitable, and in the hopes that World War II would gain their corporations even more profit. In order to convince the wealthy and elite of the world to support your political movement, and to assist in the finance, even though at the end of the day they know they'll get paid back with government contracts, one needs to make oneself seem more respectable. So what fascists did intentionally in the 1920s and 30s was reached out to international leaders of business and commerce and attempted to make friends. One of the most notorious figures involved in this predicament of the 1930s was Thomas Watson, who was CEO of the international corporation IBM, who along with his position at IBM was also head of the International Chamber of Commerce. Here's a quote here from the New York Times about in 1937 how Thomas Watson visited Adolf Hitler personally in Berlin and received an award for this man for the great service that Thomas Watson and IBM had bestowed upon the Third Reich. Thomas Watson stating, "Valuing fully the spirit of friendship which underlay this honor, I assure you that in the future, as in the past, I will endeavor to do all that is in my power to create more intimate bonds between our two great nations. My wife and my family join in best wishes for you." Essentially, Adolf Hitler reached out to international business leaders like Thomas Watson and used this sense of personal friendship with Watson to try and court other business leaders to promote the Nazi regime. One of the reasons why individuals like Thomas Watson were willing to meet with Adolf Hitler and to work with the Nazi regime is that Watson wasn't the first major business leader that the Nazis had reached out to. Throughout the 1920s and 30s, the Nazis reached out to different iconic figures throughout the world, particularly the American industrialist Henry Ford. While we usually think about Henry Ford with associating with ideas about American individualism, about ideas of American production, the assembly line, we oftentimes forget that also in the year 1919, Henry Ford wrote a book that was entitled The International Jew, the World's Foremost Problem. This book, after it was published initially in 1919, came out in a German edition in 1920, and was one of the first anti-Semitic books that Adolf Hitler read in the early days of the Nazi movement. While this wouldn't necessarily turn into a relationship, we can see here in 1937 this picture in the upper left-hand corner is of Detroit school children out in the streets holding a parade in honor of Henry Ford for his 75th birthday. The picture to the right of that is Henry Ford receiving the Grand Cross of the German Eagle from the German ambassador to the United States, as a personal birthday gift from Adolf Hitler for his 75th birthday. Now we've got to ask ourselves the question, why on earth did individuals like Henry Ford and like Thomas Watson openly receive gifts from Adolf Hitler in the American public mind? Outside of a great admiration and respect, one of the main reasons why Hitler wanted to honor Ford for his 75th birthday was for the ideological impact that Henry Ford had had personally on the formation of the early Nazi movement. This first quote was from Baldur von Schrock, who was head of what was called in the 1930s the Hitler Youth Movement. This is a quote from Schrock from the Nuremberg war crimes trials after World War II, where he said, quote, "The decisive anti-Semitic book which I read at that time, and the book which influenced my comrades, was Henry Ford's book, The International Jew. I read it and became anti-Semitic. This book made in those days a great impression on my friends and myself because we saw in Henry Ford the representative of success." Now, a quote like this, Baldur von Schrock was in charge of all youth programs for the entirety of Nazi Germany. He openly admits, he said, "Where did I get my ideas of anti-Semitism? It wasn't from Adolf Hitler, it was from Henry Ford." We can also look directly at how Henry Ford influenced Adolf Hitler. In an interview in 1928, when Hitler was asked by a reporter about the origins of the Nazi movement, Hitler replied, "I regard Henry Ford as my personal inspiration." By utilizing icons like Henry Ford, Adolf Hitler was able to gain even greater sense of respectability when it came down to international relations, in particular since during the 1930s, Henry Ford was hands down the most famous person on the planet. Well, outside of Babe Ruth. Yeah, the most famous person on the planet. One would hope, though, that the head of Ford Motor Company, one of the largest auto manufacturers in the world, would be an isolated incident. But it wasn't. During the 1930s, General Motors, through its German subsidiary Adam Opel, forged a very close relationship with Adolf Hitler, providing some of the most important technological achievements of the 1930s when it came to synthetic fuel technology and the development of troop carrier trucks. There's a quote here from the GM Stockholders newsletter in 1936, where Vice President of General Motors James Mooney stated, "We ought to make some arrangement with Germany for the future. There is no reason why we should let our moral indignation over what happened to that country stand in the way." For his service to the Third Reich and for his open public support of saying that fascism can be profitable for corporations internationally, James Mooney, like Thomas Watson and Henry Ford, was given the Grand Cross of the German Eagle for his service to the Third Reich. Similar to our analysis of Henry Ford, one would hope within the GM Corporation that somebody like James Mooney was an isolated character. As vice president, he was in charge of all overseas operations, so of course he would have relationships with political leaders throughout the entirety of Europe. There's a quote here, though, from June of 1940, about 8 months after the outbreak of World War II, from the president of General Motors, Alfred Sloan. Alfred Sloan being asked by a reporter what he thought about the recent fall of France. And he said, quote, "It seems clear that the Allies are outclassed on mechanical equipment, and it is foolish to talk about modernizing their armies in times like these. They ought to have thought of that 5 years ago. There is no excuse for them not thinking of that except for the unintelligent, in fact stupid, narrow-minded, and selfish leadership which the democracies of the world are cursed with. There is nothing for the democracies to do but to fold up and surrender. That is what it looks as if they are going to do." This is 8 months after the outbreak of World War II, and admittedly, this is well over a year before the United States has entered this war, but this is the president of the most powerful corporation on the entire planet trying to put pressure upon the other political leaders of Europe to simply surrender to Adolf Hitler and the Nazis, because he says, "You're not going to win this war." Part of the reason being is that GM had provided the Nazis with some of the most important technologies of the 1930s, a theme that will be explored in our next video on Ford, General Motors, IBM, and the Nazi regime. So now that we've explored some of the more controversial features of fascism in the 1920s and 30s, and the associations that were made between major corporations, and between fascist powers, we need to ask ourselves a few questions then about the year 1919 and where it is that fascist movements initially came from. One of the great challenges for soldiers in the year 1919 was that nobody expected World War I to come to an end so quickly, which meant when peace was signed on November 11th, 1918, this was a good thing, except that if you were a soldier, it now meant you were unemployed. And one of the great challenges of wars is that when you bring a war to an end, veterans come home looking for a job. And for the fact that wartime production is based upon private corporations building for the war effort, it also means once a war is over that private corporations shut down their productions and lay people off, which means you always have a great crisis when it comes to unemployment at the end of any global conflict. One of the ways then in the nations of Germany and Italy for unemployed soldiers to find some way of paying the bills and some place to live, particularly during the bitter cold winter of the initial months of 1919, was to get involved in fascism. In January of 1919, essentially independent militia, what some would call in the Latin American context, death squads, were formed in Germany and called the Free Corps. What the Free Corps were was essentially unemployed veterans hired on by corporate leaders to break up strikes. In particular, there were threats of revolution going on in Berlin and in Munich in January of 1919. The Free Corps came in as independent militias to crush out the striking workers and to assassinate socialist leaders to make sure that Germany did not follow a similar path to the Soviet Union. One young unemployed veteran who witnessed all of this was Corporal Adolf Hitler. In January of 1919, Adolf Hitler, unemployed, was living in a former army barracks in the German city of Munich. In January of 1919, he saw veterans utilizing wealthy people to get jobs. Essentially, wealthy people saying to veterans, if you're willing to shoot that person over there, I'll give you some money. And what Adolf Hitler realized was that veterans could have a voice if they exploited the fears that wealthy people had of socialist revolution. It's in the couple months after the Free Corps smashed out the uprisings in Berlin and Munich that Adolf Hitler got involved with the birth of a brand new political party called the Nazis. In Italy, the pattern was similar in terms of wealthy support of fascists, but the dynamics initially were quite different. Benito Mussolini, who was the first fascist politician in the world, started off in politics prior to World War I, not as a fascist on the far right, but as a socialist on the far left. He was one of the most well-known journalists in all of Italy, and he wrote exclusively pieces for the Italian Socialist Party. What was different with Mussolini when the war broke out is that while many of his fellow socialists denounced the war and would not get involved, Mussolini signed up for the war and found the war to be an absolutely glorious period of his life, until he got injured in the summer of 1917. After Mussolini was injured on the battlefield in the summer of 1917, he was sent home and he was unemployed and had no way of paying his bills. What occurred during that summer was a strange turn of events, where the British MI5, which is the British version of the CIA, contacted Mussolini and offered this man a job. They said, number one, you're a well-respected journalist. Would you like to write again? And Mussolini said, oh, of course I'd love to write again. They said, number two, since you used to be a socialist, you know where all the socialist leaders live, and you know something about their family life and how we could threaten them if we need to. Would you be willing to utilize that knowledge and sell out your former comrades? And Mussolini's great question said, well, perhaps, he said, how much are you willing to pay? And what the British government was willing to pay an unemployed veteran for anti-socialist propaganda and to beat up socialist leaders is, in modern numbers, the equivalent of $500,000 a year. And Mussolini, being an unemployed veteran, seeing a scenario, said, well, hell yeah, sign me up. And the birth of the first fascist movement was actually the British government hiring on a former socialist to sell his comrades and to be a propagandist against ideas of the Russian Revolution, the spread of socialism. What Mussolini quickly discovered was it wasn't just the British government who was willing to foot the bill for such a movement, but the Italian employers were also willing to cough up huge amounts of money to fund unemployed veterans to beat up striking workers. Over the next several years, Mussolini put together a movement that was oftentimes referred to as the Black Shirts, essentially the first fascist movement in modern times. The Black Shirts were hired on by different industrialists throughout Italy, is that when workers would go on strike, the Black Shirts would be brought in to torture and murder union leaders, and when socialists were elected to political office in Italy and threatened to use the power of government to stand up for union workers, fascists were brought in to murder socialist leaders. And by 1924, Mussolini was able to use the funding of Italian industrialists and this great fear of international socialism to rise up to become the undisputed dictator of the first fascist government in the world, Fascist Italy. Essentially, what 1919 did was that fascism provided an opportunity for jobs for veterans and profits for corporations. At the end of World War I, corporations that had made a huge amount of money and who missed those profits saw within fascism the opportunity to prepare for World War II and to become billionaires once again. For the fact that the United States was only attacked once during World War II, and it was at one of our naval bases far off in the middle of the Pacific, Americans have a very different popular memory of the experience of World War II. We typically glorify World War II in movies, in culture, in writing, and think of it as a heroic conquest of good versus evil. What that throws off is the larger global analysis of World War II as the greatest tragedy ever in human history. Not only did World War II facilitate a horrible genocide and the Holocaust that led to the death of almost 10 million people, a systematic process of state-sponsored mass murder, but in the bigger picture of the global conflict of World War II, it's approximated by historians that between Allied losses, Axis losses, and the loss of civilians due to starvation and other things because of the war, that close to 80 million people died during the period of World War II. This isn't some heroic story of good versus evil, right versus wrong. It's a tragedy, and it's a tragedy that humanity saw looming on the horizon throughout the 1930s. And the more and more I've studied this as a professional for the last 20 years, the more I've recognized that World War II was both predictable and preventable. What this means then, in our next movie, when we look at how different corporations related with the Nazi regime and helped to bring about the lead up to World War II, is to ask the question, who was responsible for the death of those 80 million people throughout the world? And if it was predictable that this would happen, why didn't people do more to try and prevent it?